The mud on his boots was the only honest thing about him. Jonathan Vale, 6th Duke of Velmore, stood in the shadow of a dying oak and watched a house full of strangers prepare to sell him a wife. He had ridden a day early and told no one. He wore a groom's coat and carried nothing that named him. If Farnall House thought a duke was coming tomorrow at noon in a gleaming carriage, then tonight, in the wet dark, he could watch them be exactly what they were. What he heard in the next 10 minutes would decide the rest of his life. He did not know that yet. He thought he was only confirming what he already believed. He was wrong. And so, dear viewer, before we go one step further into that garden, ask yourself, what would you do if the woman you were about to marry for money turned out to be nothing like the one you'd been told to expect? Stay close. This one earns every minute. 3 weeks earlier, Louisa Holt had stopped hoping for anything that wasn't weather-related. She was 24, the elder of the 2 Holt daughters, and she had long ago made peace with being the one who counted the candles instead of the one who was lit by them. Her sister Henriette was gold and noise and certainty. Louisa was the gray dress in the corner, refitted from her mother's wardrobe, useful the way a good coat is useful, worn without thanks, missed only when gone. Farnall had been failing for longer than Louisa could accurately remember not failing. She knew the sound the roof made before rain, a low tin groan 2 rooms could hear through the walls. She knew which stair creaked loud enough to wake her father, and which one didn't, and used the second when she came down before dawn to see how much coal was left. She had stopped mentioning the numbers to her mother months ago, because her mother had a way of hearing bad news and turning it, within the hour, into someone else's fault. Louisa had decided it was easier to simply solve what she could and say nothing about the rest. That morning the fire in the breakfast room had burned down to almost nothing, and Louisa was rebuilding it log by careful log when old Thomas came in with a single letter on a tray that had not seen polish in a month. Her father broke the seal. She watched the color climb into his face the way water climbs a wick. "The Duke of Velmore," Sir Alistair said, and his voice cracked on the title like a boy's. "He proposes to settle every debt this family owes, in exchange for marriage, to my daughter." Henriette set down her spoon so gently it might have been made of glass. "A duke," she said, testing the word the way she tested new gowns. "The Duchess of Velmore. It has a certain shape to it, doesn't it?" Nobody looked at Louisa. Nobody needed to. It had never once, in the whole architecture of that family, occurred to any of them that the letter could mean her. She went on feeding the fire. She told herself the tightness in her chest was smoke. Lady Holt was already on her feet, moving through the room with the frantic energy of a woman rehearsing a speech she hadn't written yet. "We must write back at once. We must accept. Obviously we accept. But we mustn't seem too eager, Alistair. It isn't dignified." She caught sight of the state of the tablecloth and made a small, wounded sound. "And we must do something about the house. He cannot see it like this." "He'll see it exactly like this," Louisa said quietly, not looking up from the grate. "There's no version of 2 days that turns a leaking roof into a sound one." Her mother didn't hear her, or chose not to. That, too, was familiar. Henriette had already left the table, already halfway up the stairs to inventory a wardrobe she meant to replace entirely within the year. Sir Alistair sat very still with the letter in his hands, reading it a second time, then a third, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something less like a miracle and more like a debt of a different kind. She had no way of knowing that 200 miles south, a man who had never met either of them was already deciding not to trust a word his own contract said. The 2 days that followed were the busiest Farnall had seen in a decade, and Louisa spent nearly all of them on her knees or on a ladder. She beat the rugs herself when the one remaining manservant's back gave out halfway through the second. She climbed into the guest suite's dusty grate with a brush and a rag because the chimney sweep wanted money they didn't have to spare, and came down black to the elbows and washed, and went straight to the linen press to see what could still be salvaged. She cut the last of the garden's roses for the hall. Not the good ones, there were no good ones left, but the least wilted, and arranged them with the same care she gave everything no one would ever thank her for. Henriette, meanwhile, conducted a full and detailed audit of her own wardrobe, holding gown after gown up to the light of the window and pronouncing each one, in turn, unworthy of a duke's attention. "This one makes me look sallow," she informed the room, to no one in particular, since no one in particular was listening. "I shall need something new. Mamma, we must send to York." "There is no money to send to York," Louisa said, not unkindly, from where she knelt, polishing the fire irons. "There will be," Henriette said, with the serene confidence of a girl who had never once in her life been told no and made to believe it. "The moment the settlement is signed." Sir Alistair spent both days reading the letter and rereading it, and once Louisa caught him simply holding it, not reading it at all, staring at the middle distance, the way a drowning man might stare at a rope he hadn't quite believed was real. She didn't ask him what he was thinking. She thought she already knew, and she didn't want to hear him say it, that in 2 days' time, one of his daughters would stop being his responsibility and become someone else's, and that he had not, in all his rereading, spared a single thought for which daughter that ought to be. By the second evening, the house was as presentable as 5 years of decline and 48 hours of desperate labor could make it, which was to say, presentable enough to fool a stranger who wasn't looking closely, and not nearly enough to fool one who was. Louisa didn't know yet which kind of stranger was coming. In London, the Duke of Velmore stood at his solicitor's window with his back to the desk, because it was easier to hear bad news without a face to arrange around it. "The dowry is £20,000, Your Grace," said Mr. Etherton. "Sir Alistair has accepted every term without amendment. He seems—" a pause, delicately weighted, "eager." "Eager men lie the most convincingly," Jonathan said. "Cancel the carriage." "Your Grace? I'll go on horseback, alone, a day early." He turned from the window at last, and his eyes were the flat gray of a sky before weather. "I have spent 5 years selling off everything my father didn't already ruin to keep 4,000 people fed. I am not going to buy a wife blind on top of it." Etherton set down his pen very carefully, the way a man sets down something that might go off. "That is highly irregular." "So is marrying a stranger to save a mine," the Duke said. "I want to see this family as they actually are, not as they intend to perform for me." He did not say what he feared he would find. He didn't need to. He had already built her in his mind. A grasping girl with a father's debts and a duke-shaped hole where her affection should be. He rode north, expecting to catch a liar in the act. He caught something else entirely, and by the time he understood what it was already too late to ride away from it. The garden at Farnall was overgrown at its edges, roses gone leggy and half wild, where no one had the shillings to spare for a gardener's full attention. It was here, in the failing light, that Jonathan found the 2 sisters he had come a day early to spy on. He knew the golden one on sight. He had been told to expect radiance, and here it was, complaining. An entire year out of fashion, Henriette was saying, plucking at her sleeve like it had personally wronged her. "The Duke will think us paupers." "We are paupers, Henriette." The other voice was lower, unhurried. It did not ask to be believed, it simply was. "We won't be, once I'm his Duchess. A house in town, a box at the opera." Henriette's laugh had a bright, brittle edge, like something dropped that hadn't broken yet, but would. "And between you and me, once he's served his purpose, there's still Lord Ashworth. A duchess is allowed her secrets. Aren't we all?" Jonathan felt something in his jaw go tight enough to ache. He had come looking for greed. He had not expected to find betrayal already fitted for the wedding. He was ready to leave, to ride back to London and let the whole gilded wreck of his inheritance come down around him rather than marry into that. When the quiet sister spoke again, and something in her voice made him stay exactly where he was. "You shouldn't speak that way," she said. "Not sharp, tired, the way truth is tired when it's been saying the same thing for years without being heard. You're building a house on sand. A title isn't a home, Henriette. Kindness is a home. Honesty is a home. You can't buy either one." Henriette laughed, that same brittle sound, called her sister a fool in a gray dress, and swept off toward the house to be admired by someone easier to please. The one left behind did not cry. That was the detail Jonathan would carry with him longest. She simply reached out, without seeming to decide to, and touched the last living rose on the bush beside her, one careful finger along a wilting petal, as though she were checking whether it, too, had given up yet. He watched her do that for a long moment in the dark, a woman entirely alone and entirely unaware she was watched, and understood two things with sudden, cold clarity. The contract said Miss Halt. It did not say which one. And he had already made his choice. And he had already made his choice. He just hadn't told anyone yet, least of all her. Which meant that tomorrow at noon, when he walked through that front door as himself for the first time, one of these two sisters was about to have the worst morning of her life. The only question left was which. Noon arrived at Farnell, dressed for company. Rugs beaten, silver dragged from its tarnish, the last of the good linen aired for a guest suite that hadn't held a guest in years. Louisa had organized all of it, the menus, the flowers, the seating, while Henriette drifted through the house, rehearsing the exact tilt of a future duchess's chin. Louisa didn't resent it. She was too tired for resentment. It took energy she didn't have to spare. What she felt instead, watching her sister perfect a curtsy in the hall mirror, was something closer to grief for a version of her own life she'd never actually been promised, and so couldn't properly claim to have lost. The carriage on the drive was smart, not grand. 4 matched grays, no crest. The family assembled in the hall like a photograph no one had asked to be in. Sir Alistair sweating in his good coat. Henriette a vision in pale blue. Louisa a step behind them all, by the door, ready, as always, to disappear the moment she was no longer required. Then the Duke of Velmore walked in, and every plan in that hall came apart at once. He was not old. He was not soft. He moved like a man who had spent years being underestimated and had stopped correcting people about it. His eyes swept the room once. Sir Alistair, Lady Halt, Henriette's flawless performance of a curtsy, and something in them did not warm at all. Then his gaze found Louisa in the shadow by the door and held. 1 second, 2, 3. She had never seen this man in her life. And yet he looked at her the way you look at something you've already decided about. He crossed the hall, past Henriette, whose curtsy hung unfinished and unacknowledged in the air behind him. He stopped directly in front of Louisa, close enough that she had to tilt her chin to hold his eyes, close enough to catch rain and leather and cold, clean air clinging to his coat. "You are Miss Louisa Holt." It wasn't a question. Her voice, when she found it, came out smaller than she meant it to. "I am, Your Grace. The contract is for your hand." His voice carried to every corner of a room that had gone entirely, dangerously silent. "I am choosing the elder." Henriette made a sound, like something breaking, that hadn't quite decided how loudly to break. Sir Alister's mouth opened and produced nothing at all, and Louisa stood there, with a duke's hand held out to her, like a door she hadn't known existed, and understood, with a clarity that frightened her more than the offer itself, that her entire family was no longer looking at her as a daughter. They were looking at her as an obstacle. She lifted her chin anyway. She put her hand, work-roughened, unringed, entirely her own, into his. It was the first decision of her adult life that belonged to no one but her. She had absolutely no idea, in that moment, whether she had just saved herself or signed her own doom in gilt ink. The week that followed, her family barely spoke to her, except to ask, over and over, in every possible tone, why? Louisa didn't have an answer she was willing to give them, because the true one, "He looked at me like I already mattered," sounded, even in her own head, dangerously close to hope, and hope was a thing she'd learned young not to hand out on credit. The Duke visited daily. Their conversations were careful, formal things. Flowers, books, the running of an estate she'd never seen. He asked questions, and then actually listened to the answers, which was, she was slowly realizing, the rarest kindness anyone had shown her in years. Lawyers came and went with papers she signed without fully reading, trusting a stranger's word over her own father's, which told her something about her father she chose not to examine too closely. Her dowry, the small inheritance left by a grandmother she barely remembered, passed out of Sir Alister's control forever, and into a marriage settlement drawn up by a man she had known for 4 days. She learned him in fragments, the way you learn a house by finding its creaking floorboards one at a time. He did not like fuss. He preferred silence to conversation that existed only to fill a room. The staff at his inn were quietly terrified of him, and yet she watched him press a coin into a stable boy's palm for nothing more than a horse well cared for, when he clearly believed no one of consequence was looking. It was a small thing. She filed it away and said nothing about having seen it. She never asked him why he'd chosen her. She told herself it was pride. It was closer to fear. Fear that the answer was pity, or a whim already regretted, and that asking would be the exact motion that shattered it. Better, she decided, to leave the question sealed, like a letter she wasn't ready to know the contents of. 4 days before the wedding, he found her in the small library at Farnole, 3 shelves, mostly sermons, and 1 battered atlas, running a finger along spines that hadn't been dusted in years. "You read," he said, not a question, the way most things he said weren't questions. "When there's time, there isn't always time." She pulled down the atlas, its spine cracked white with age. "This was my grandmother's. I used to trace the shipping routes and imagine I was on one of them. And now? Now I know where the routes actually go. Cold places, mostly, full of men who count things for a living." She glanced at him, testing whether he'd take the small joke as it was meant. No offense intended, Your Grace. Something almost like a laugh moved through him, brief and startled, as if it had caught him off guard as much as her. None taken. I have, in fact, spent most of my adult life counting things. He took the atlas from her hands, careful not to let his fingers brush hers, and opened it to a map of the north. This is closer to where you'll be living. Blackwood is here. He tapped a spot, inked in faded brown. The mines are here, and here. It rains considerably more than it does at Farnall. You're trying to warn me off. I'm trying to tell you the truth, before you're too far in to change your mind about wanting it. He closed the atlas gently. Most people wait until after the wedding to discover what they've actually agreed to. I'd rather you knew now. She found, turning that over later, that it was the kindest thing anyone had said to her in years. Not a compliment, not a flattery, just an offer of the truth, freely given, before she'd had to fight for it. She was beginning to suspect that this was simply how he loved, if he loved at all yet, in careful, unglamorous honesties, handed over one at a time, like a man distributing his own rationed store of warmth. 2 days before the wedding, he asked her to walk with him in the garden, the same garden, though he did not say so, and she did not yet know it. The light was failing in the same way it had the evening he'd stood beneath the oak and listened to her sister call her a fool. "You're quiet today," he said, hands clasped behind his back, matching his stride to hers without seeming to notice he'd done it. "I'm quiet most days." Not the same quiet. He glanced at her sideways. This one has a question in it. She considered lying. She was tired, suddenly, of being careful. "Why me?" she said. "You could have had my sister. Everyone expected you to. It would have cost you nothing." He stopped walking. For a long moment he looked at the dying rosebush beside the path, and something crossed his face that she couldn't name yet but would, months later, recognize as guilt. "It would have cost me everything," he said finally. "I just didn't know that until I'd already decided." He didn't explain further. She didn't push, but she noticed, filed it away, the way she filed away the coin for the stable boy, that he'd chosen his words the way a man chooses which floorboards to avoid, carefully, and for reasons he wasn't ready to name. "That isn't an answer," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't, but it's the truest thing I can give you tonight." She let it stand. It was, she would think later, the first time in her life a man had told her the truth by way of what he refused to say. They married on a cold, bright October morning in the parish church at Farnall, her family stiff on one side, the Duke standing entirely alone on the other, as though he had already learned, long before she had, what it meant to belong to no one. Her wedding dress was dove-gray silk, plain and exact, because she had told the modiste she wanted something she could wear again, and the modiste had looked at her as if she'd asked for something obscene. When she put it on, it felt less like a gown and more like armor. He said his vows in a low voice that made the air in the church seem to hold still. When he slid the ring onto her finger, his hand was cool and steady, and did not let go a moment longer than it should have. She was a duchess now. She still felt, underneath the silk, exactly like a girl who had spent her whole life rebuilding other people's fires. She had no idea, riding away from Farnall without once looking back, that the coldest part of her marriage was still ahead of her, and that it would arrive not from her husband, but from the family she'd left behind. The journey north took the better part of 3 days, and for most of it they sat across from each other in a silence that was, she would later decide, one of the more honest conversations they'd yet had. He read. She watched the country change through the window, the soft green of the south giving way, mile by mile, to something harder and grayer, stone walls instead of hedgerows, sky that seemed to sit lower on the land the further they traveled. On the second night, at an inn too small for either of their titles, he ordered a private parlor and a simple meal, and for once neither of them reached for a book or an excuse to look away from the other. "You haven't asked me anything about Blackwood," he said, watching her over the rim of his cup. "I assumed you'd tell me what I needed to know when I needed to know it." Most women would have asked about the household, the staff, whether there's a modiste within reach. He said it without judgment, simply observing. "I've never had a modiste within reach in my life. I don't imagine I'll miss what I've never had." She met his eyes. "What I'd like to know is whether the roof leaks." Something in his face eased, just slightly, the ghost of the almost smile she was beginning to recognize as his version of open laughter. "It does not leak. I can promise you that much." "Then I believe we'll manage," she said, and meant it more than she expected to. Blackwood Manor rose out of the northern landscape like something that had grown there rather than been built. Dark stone, high windows, a house that impressed before it ever welcomed. It was nothing like Farnell, which had at least the decency to look as tired as it was. Blackwood looked magnificent and felt, the moment Louisa stepped through its doors, entirely uninhabited by anything warm. The staff lined up to receive them with the careful, guarded curiosity of people meeting a rumor in the flesh. The plain bride, who had somehow unseated the beauty everyone had assumed was coming instead. Mrs. Graves, the housekeeper, looked at Louisa the way one might look at a substitution in a recipe, uncertain whether the dish would still turn out right. Dinner that first night was a lesson in distance. They sat at opposite ends of a table long enough to require raised voices, and instead used none at all. Louisa watched candlelight travel the length of silver and crystal, and thought, with the flat honesty she reserved for herself alone, "What have I done? Is the meal to your liking, Your Grace?" he asked at last, formal as a stranger. "It is excellent, but you mustn't call me Your Grace. I have a name." Something almost moved at the corner of his mouth. "Then you must use mine as well." It was a small thing. It was the first crack in a wall she hadn't realized either of them had been building. She lay awake that night in a bed built for 4 people and occupied by exactly one, and let herself, for the first time since the hall at Farnell, feel the full weight of what she'd agreed to. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears solved nothing and satisfied no one but the people who'd caused them. She rose the next morning with a decision instead. She would not be ornamental in this house. If it was going to be her life, she would make it hers. She found the kitchens before the staff expected anyone above them to be awake, introduced herself, asked the terrifying Mrs. Graves to teach her the house from the ground up, learned the maid's name, the gardener's habit of growing roses no one but him ever saw, the exact hour the ovens were lit. She found the library last, 2 stories of books gone gray under a decade of dust, a room that had clearly once been the heart of the house and had simply stopped beating. She opened the curtains. She began, book by book, to bring it back. Jonathan noticed before he said anything about it. He always did. He'd come home from long hours over ledgers that made his shoulders climb toward his ears, and find small changes waiting for him like something left on a doorstep, roses on a hall table, beeswax where there had only been must, the sound of quiet, purposeful movement in rooms that used to hold only silence. It was Mrs. Graves who first told him what his wife had done for the Pruitt family, though Louisa herself never mentioned it. The youngest Pruitt boy had taken a fever in November, and the family, tenants on the estate's furthest edge, had no money for a physician and too much pride to ask for one. Louisa had heard of it from a kitchen maid, said nothing to anyone, and simply gone, on foot, in the cold, with a basket of broth and blankets and a jar of her own preserved ginger, and sat with the boy's mother through the worst of the night until the fever broke toward dawn. "She didn't want it known, Your Grace," Mrs. Graves said, when Jonathan asked why he hadn't heard of it sooner. "Said it wasn't a kindness if you did it to be seen doing it." He found Louisa in the library that evening, and stood in the doorway longer than he needed to, watching her mend a tear in a piece of household linen with the same unhurried concentration she gave everything. "You went to the Pruitts alone, at night, in the cold." She didn't look up from her stitching. "Someone had to. You could have sent for the physician. I would have paid for it gladly. By the time a letter reached you, and a writer reached him, the boy might not have needed a physician anymore." She tied off her thread and finally met his eyes. "I didn't do it to be praised, Jonathan. I'd rather you didn't praise me for it now." He didn't. But he sat with her a while longer than he'd meant to that evening, and when he rose to leave, he touched her shoulder briefly, wordlessly, in a way that said more than any of his careful sentences ever had. One evening he came down to a dinner table that had been shortened, the leaves removed, the two of them now close enough to speak, without raising their voices at all. He stood in the doorway a moment longer than necessary. "This is an improvement," he said. From him she was beginning to understand. That was very nearly a love letter. She had no idea it would take a flooded mind and a moment of complete surrender to make him say anything closer to the truth than that. She found him one night, hunched over a ledger, with a candle burning too low and his whole body arranged like a man bracing for a blow that had already landed several times before. She brought him tea he hadn't asked for. "You don't have to do that," he said. "There are servants." "The servants aren't your wife." He looked up at that word, the way a man looks at a door he'd forgotten was in the room. "Stay," he said, when she turned to go. "Please?" He told her everything. Then, the flooded Tinaley mine, the failing pump, his father's appetite for ruin, and the son's 5 silent years trying to outwork it. He did not tell her about the garden, or what he'd overheard there. That shame, apparently, went deeper than debt. She listened without interrupting, without offering the easy comfort that costs nothing and fixes less. "I'm sorry," he said finally, voice rough, "to have trapped you in this." "You didn't trap me." She met his eyes across the desk. "I walked in with mine open, and you are not carrying this alone anymore. We're married. Your burdens are mine now too." Something in him that had been braced for 5 years came, quietly, undone. It would be tested soon enough, publicly, viciously, in front of half of London, but for tonight, in a study lit by one low candle, Jonathan Vale understood he had gone looking for a solution to his ruin, and found, instead, the one thing his ledgers could never have predicted he needed. He should have known better than to think that peace, once found, would go unchallenged. Peace like that always draws a crowd of people determined to end it. London came for business, not pleasure. Appearances to maintain, a ruined duke's ruin to keep quiet a while longer. Louisa found the city overwhelming in the particular way that noise is overwhelming to someone raised on silence. Not frightening exactly, just loud, in a way that never let up. Their townhouse on the square was full of mirrors and gilt, and the kind of grandeur that made her feel, at first, like a servant who had wandered into the wrong wing of the house and hadn't yet been asked to leave. With Jonathan beside her, though, it was survivable. He did not enjoy society any more than she did, she came to understand, in those first crowded weeks, that his reputation for coldness was simply the shape a very private man took when forced into rooms full of strangers who wanted something from him. They were, in that at least, well matched. Society was curious, then unkind, in that order. The story of the Duke's strange choice had traveled ahead of them. The country nobody who'd somehow outmaneuvered the beauty. They watched Louisa with the sharp, appraising interest of people looking for the flaw that would explain it. She met their looks with a stillness she'd had practice in long before any of them had noticed her. Then Henriette arrived, uninvited, trailing behind a cousin's party like a scent that follows you into a room. "Louisa, darling," she said, sweeping in for an embrace that had nothing warm inside it. "I've come to see how you're getting on." What followed was not a war. It was quieter than that, and worse. A slow campaign of sighs and sympathetic little confidences, dropped in exactly the ears that would carry them furthest. Poor Louisa. Always so odd. One does wonder what hold she has over him. Invitations thinned, whispers thickened. Jonathan wanted to send her sister away outright. "No," Louisa said. "That's exactly what she wants. You the tyrant, me the victim. We'll be neither." The trial of it came to a head at a small afternoon gathering thrown by a cousin of Henriette's. The kind of tea where 12 women crowded into a drawing room meant for 8 and called it intimate. Louisa had not wanted to attend. Jonathan had insisted, gently, that avoiding society entirely would only feed the story that she had something to hide. She sat near the window, her tea going cold, while Henriette held court in the center of the room, glowing, magnanimous, generous, with a kind of pity that cut deeper than any insult could have. Poor Louisa was never one for company, Henriette told the room, patting her sister's hand with performed affection. Even as a girl, she preferred to sit alone. It's rather sweet, really, that the Duke should have taken pity on her the way he did. A ripple of polite, poisonous laughter went around the room. Louisa felt the old, familiar heat climb her neck. The specific humiliation of being discussed as though she weren't present, as though her silence proved every unkind thing being said about it. "I don't require pity," Louisa said quietly, when the laughter had died down enough for her voice to carry. "Nor did my husband offer any. I'd ask you to remember that the next time you're tempted to explain my marriage to a room that knows nothing about it." It wasn't sharp, it wasn't loud, but something in her tone made 2 of the women look away, suddenly very interested in their teacups, and Henriette's smile flickered, just once, just barely, before she recovered it. "Of course, darling," Henriette said. "I only meant it kindly." She never meant anything kindly. Louisa understood that now, with a clarity that felt almost like relief. There was no version of her sister that had ever wished her well, and pretending otherwise had cost her years she wasn't getting back. She rode home in the carriage that afternoon and said nothing to Jonathan about what had happened, because there was nothing new to report, only the same old cruelty, wearing a new dress for a new city. She had no way of knowing that Henriette had already found her weapon and that it wore a lieutenant's uniform, and that it was going to be unveiled at the one ball in London neither of them could afford to miss. Lady Mariella's ballroom on the night of her annual event was a small galaxy of chandeliers and old money, the kind of room where reputations were made or unmade between one dance and the next. Louisa wore green that night, not gray, a deep forest velvet Jonathan had commissioned without telling her, the exact shade that made her eyes look lit from somewhere behind them. "You are beautiful," he told her at the foot of the stairs, and it was the first time he had ever said the word to her at all. They danced first, and for a few unguarded minutes the room fell away, and there was nothing but his hand at her waist, and the certainty, entirely new to her, of being somewhere she belonged. It didn't last. Henriette had timed her moment with a precision that would have been admirable in any other context. She produced the lieutenant like a card laid face up on a table, loud enough for the room to hear every word. "How lovely to see old friends," she said, "sweet as poisoned sugar. I was just telling the lieutenant about your long walks by the river, Louisa. You were always so fond of him." It was a lie, built on a splinter of truth so thin it should have snapped under its own weight. It didn't matter. In a room already primed to believe the worst of her, the lie grew wings before Louisa could open her mouth to deny it. She looked at Jonathan. For one terrible second, one single heartbeat in which the whole evening seemed to balance on a blade's edge, she saw something that might have been doubt cross his face, and felt something in her chest crack straight down the middle. Then his expression closed over like a door shutting, and she understood, with a rush of relief so sharp it nearly buckled her knees, that the doubt hadn't been for her at all. It had been the last half-second he needed to decide exactly how he was going to end this. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. "My wife does not lie," he said, and the room went silent, the way rooms go silent, around something dangerous. He turned to the lieutenant next, and produced, almost gently, a folded note from inside his coat. "A word of advice, Lieutenant. When you sell your honor, ask a higher price than £500. Yours, it seems, was worth considerably less." The young man went the color of old paper. Then, at last, Jonathan turned to Henriette, and Louisa watched her sister's triumphant smile falter for the first time in either of their lives. "You speak of my wife's past," he said, quiet enough that the entire ballroom had to lean in to catch it. "Perhaps we ought to discuss yours. I arrived at Farnall a day early, Miss Holt. I stood in your garden. I heard every word you said about Lord Ashworth, and about the secrets a duchess is entitled to keep." Henriette's face went through several expressions in quick succession, and none of them landed anywhere near composure. "I chose my wife," Jonathan continued, and now he turned, and the ice in his voice thawed into something the whole room could see plainly was not for public consumption at all, not for her beauty, though she is the finest woman in this room, not for her connections, since she had none to offer me. I chose her for her honesty, for a quiet dignity you have never once, in your entire life, taken the trouble to understand. He raised Louisa's hand to his lips in front of everyone who had ever whispered about her. Henriette fled the ballroom in tears that were, for the first time anyone present could remember, entirely her own and not performed for an audience. Louisa watched her go and felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, but a small, sad ache for a girl who had been taught her whole life that her face was the only currency she'd ever need, and had just discovered, in front of everyone, that the coin had stopped being worth anything at all. "I'm sorry," Jonathan murmured against her hair as the music started again. Sorry you ever had to doubt, even for a second. I didn't, she said. Not really. I love you, Louisa, he said. The words neither of them had dared say first. I think I have since the moment I saw you in that garden, being brave in the dark when you thought no one was watching at all. They danced until the room forgot to whisper about anything else. A year later, autumn light came through the tall windows of the Blackwood Library, the way it comes through windows in houses that have finally learned how to be warm. The books were in order now, spines dusted and shelved by a system only Louisa fully understood. The heavy curtains stayed open past noon these days. On the floor, in a spot no one a year ago would have believed a duke would ever willingly sit, Jonathan showed a carved wooden bird to a small, dark-haired boy with his father's exact stormy eyes and his mother's habit of studying everything he was handed before deciding whether to trust it. The Tinalay mine had not been lost after all. Louisa had spent 3 long evenings with Jonathan, bent over estate maps and a 100-year-old survey no one else had thought to consult, because no one had thought, in 5 years of crisis, to ask the opinion of a woman who had spent her whole life making much out of very little. She found an old drainage channel, forgotten and half-collapsed, far cheaper to clear than any new pump could ever be. It had saved the mine, and with it, everything the mine paid for. The tenants called her a miracle. Jonathan called her his clever, practical duchess, and meant it as the highest compliment he owned. Henriette had married a wealthy merchant twice her age. It was said she had a very fine house, and more gowns than she could wear in a season, and that in a year no one had once seen her smile. Sir Alistair and Lady Holt had settled into a modest cottage outside Bath, their debts long since cleared, their days quieter than either of them had ever known how to want. Louisa wrote to them once a month, brief practical letters about the weather and the estate, and her father wrote back in a hand that had grown steadier since the letters stopped being about money he didn't have. He had never once, in any of those letters, asked her why she'd chosen the life she had. She thought, sometimes, that he already knew, and simply didn't have the words to say he was sorry he hadn't seen it sooner. "What are you thinking about?" Jonathan asked, resting his head against Louisa's knee. "A girl in a gray dress," she said, "on a stone bench, in a garden nobody had bothered to fix." "I think about her all the time too," he said. "I think about how lucky the man was who found her. He wasn't lucky." She traced the line of his jaw, unhurried, the way she did everything now that she finally had the time to. He was just paying attention. It had begun as a transaction between 2 strangers, a debt settled in exchange for a stranger's hand. It ended as the kind of love neither of them had believed, on that first cold morning at Farnole they were allowed to have. And if you're wondering, right now, what became of that first rose she touched in the dark, the one Henriette called foolish for caring about, it's worth knowing this. Louisa had a cutting of it sent north the week she left Farnole for good. It still grows outside the Blackwood Library window. Every October, without fail, it blooms one final flower before the frost. The very same week, every single year, that she first put her hand in his. Some say it's coincidence. Louisa has never once corrected them. If this one kept you until the very end, you know what to do. Tell me where you're watching from, and which line hit hardest. And don't go far, because the next story starts closer to home than you'd think.